They told her she was cursed, a blind mouth to feed when the harvest had failed and children were starving. So the village elders dragged Iskra Vale to the edge of the whispering woods and left her for the wolves that howled in the dark. But the wolves never came. Instead, a vampire king, ancient beyond memory and bored by 1,000 years of predictable courtiers, found her moving through the snow, not stumbling, not cowering, but dancing, and saw not a broken girl, but the only person in his realm who could truly see. This is the story of a girl, the world called useless, and a monster who recognized a queen. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. King Morveth moved through the whispering woods like a shadow, given form. Though he had no need for stealth, nothing in these forests could threaten him. Not the wolves, not the winter, not the passage of time itself. The gesture was habit, nothing more. A remnant from centuries ago when he'd still remembered what it meant to be prey. He'd been hunting. Not for blood, that hunger had been sated hours ago at court, but for interest, something, anything to break the suffocating monotony of his eternal existence. Another century of bowing nobles who said exactly what he expected. Another 100 years of political games he could predict 3 moves ahead. Another millennium of boredom. He couldn't keep doing this. Ruling a court of sycophants, attending balls where every dance had been choreographed 1,000 times before, listening to advisors who believed he needed a queen simply because tradition demanded it. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the sounds of the forest as Morveth moved deeper into the trees. That's when he heard her. Not the sound he expected. Sobbing, pleading, the desperate prayers of the abandoned. Instead, he heard rhythm. The soft crunch of feet moving through snow. The whisper of fabric shifting with deliberate grace. Someone was dancing. He should keep walking. God knows he'd seen enough human suffering over the centuries. Some peasant girl cast out by her village, probably for being different, probably left to die in the cold. He'd witnessed this cruelty 100 times. It always ended the same way. But his feet stopped before his mind could argue. Morveth stepped through the tree line and saw her clearly now, a young woman, perhaps 20 winters, dressed in threadbare peasant clothes that offered no protection against the killing cold. Her dark hair was pulled back from a face that might have been beautiful, if not for her eyes, milky white, unseeing, staring at nothing. She was blind, and she was dancing. Not the frantic movements of someone trying to stay warm, but something else, entirely. She moved with her head tilted slightly, listening to sounds he couldn't hear, her feet finding purchase on snow-covered ground that should have been treacherous. There was a grace to it that made his ancient heart, that rarely stirred for anything, beat just slightly faster. Up close, he could see more. Bruises on her arms where rough hands had grabbed her, dirt under her fingernails from clawing at the ground, trying to orient herself when they'd first thrown her down. Lips blue from cold, yet still pressed together in determination, rather than desperation. She wasn't crying, she wasn't begging the gods for mercy. She was surviving. Something in Morveth shifted. The predator in him recognized prey, yes, but also recognized something far more intriguing. Here was a creature that should be cowering in terror, and instead she was finding music in her own heartbeat, mapping the world through sound and touch, refusing to break even when everything else had shattered. He took a step forward. The crunch of his boot on frozen earth was nearly silent, but her head snapped toward him with supernatural precision. Her sightless eyes fixed on exactly where he stood, and for the first time in a very long time, Morveth felt seen. "I know you're there," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her body. "You've been watching for 3 minutes. The wolves circle before they attack. Is that what you're doing?" Not fear in her voice. Defiance. "I'm not a wolf," Morveth said, letting his inhuman resonance carry through the winter air. "No," her head tilted, analyzing the timbre of his words. "You're something worse. I can hear it in your voice, like stones falling into a bottomless well, like death learned to speak." A pause. "But you haven't attacked yet, so either you're playing with your food or you want something else." Morveth found himself smiling for the first time in decades. "You're not afraid." "I'm terrified," she corrected, and he could hear her heartbeat now, rapid, frantic, the sound of prey. "But I've been afraid my whole life. It doesn't make much difference anymore." He moved closer, removing his cloak in one fluid motion. The garment was worth more than her entire village. Black velvet lined with silver thread, woven with protective enchantments that had taken court mages months to craft. "Take this." "I can't." "You will." Not a command, a certainty. "You're shaking so hard you'll shatter your own bones within the hour." "Why?" The word came out raw, confused. "Why would something like you care if I freeze?" Morveth was silent for a moment, snow gathering on his shoulders where the cloak had been. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Because I've spent 1,000 years surrounded by people who claim to see, and they're all blind to anything that matters. They look at surfaces, beauty, power, gold, and call it vision." He stepped closer, his red eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "But you move through this forest better than my sighted courtiers move through torch-lit ballrooms. You hear the truth in my voice when others only hear what they want to hear." He paused, his expression shifting into something almost human. "And because you're still dancing when anyone else would be dying. That's not weakness. That's the most interesting thing I've seen in a century." Iskra stood slowly, her legs stiff from cold, but her spine straight. Her fingers reached out tentatively, found the offered cloak, felt the impossible softness of the fabric. "What are you?" she whispered. "King Morveth Kale, Lord of the Nocturnal Court, Sovereign of the Blood Realms." He said it without pride, merely stating fact. "And you are?" "Iskra Vale." A bitter laugh. "Former daughter of Thornhaven. Current? Nothing." "No." His hand reached out, careful, deliberate, and lifted her chin so her sightless eyes met his. "You are the woman who dances in the dark. And in my kingdom, that makes you the only person who's ever been qualified to stand beside me." The snow fell around them, and for the first time since her exile, Iskra felt something other than cold. She felt chosen. King Morveth Kyle had existed for 11 centuries, and in all that time, he had never been caught off guard by a mortal. Yet here stood this blind peasant girl, her milky eyes fixed precisely on his position in the shadows, and she had spoken first. The audacity of it made something long dormant stir in his chest. He'd expected her to curl inward when he revealed himself, to make herself small the way prey animals do when they sense the predator circling. Instead, Iskra Vale wrapped his cloak tighter around her shoulders and turned her head slightly, tracking his movements through the snow with unnerving accuracy. "You're still here," she observed, her voice steadier now that the cold wasn't quite so murderous. "Most things that hunt don't linger after they've been discovered. They either strike or they leave." "Perhaps I'm not hunting." Morveth moved closer, deliberately stepping on a branch. It cracked like a gunshot in the winter silence. 3 steps to my left, Iskra said immediately. You weigh more than a man should. Your footfalls are too evenly spaced. You're not human. She paused. And you broke that branch on purpose, testing me. Morveth laughed, a sound like distant thunder. You are remarkable. I'm cursed, she corrected bitterly. That's what my village called it. A mouth to feed, with no eyes to see the harvest coming. A burden during a famine. Her jaw tightened. They weren't wrong. They were blind. He stood directly before her now, close enough that his unnatural coldness cut through even the winter air. You navigate this forest better than my courtiers navigate ballrooms lit by 1,000 candles. You hear truth in voices when others only hear what they want to believe. That's not a curse. That's power they were too stupid to recognize. Iskra's breath caught. No one had ever called her powerful. No one had ever suggested her blindness was anything but a deficiency to be pitied or scorned. What do you want from me? She asked. I want to offer you a choice. Morveth extended his hand, though she couldn't see the gesture. You can stay here in these woods and freeze before dawn breaks. Or you can take my hand and come with me to a place where the darkness is not your enemy, where your senses make you extraordinary rather than expendable. And what would I be in this place? A curiosity? A pet? A student, Morveth said. I will teach you to weaponize what you already possess, to move through my court the way you move through this forest, with absolute certainty while everyone else stumbles in the light. Iskra stood silent for a long moment, the snow falling around them both. She had nothing left to lose. The village had made sure of that. She could die here in the cold, proving them right about her worthlessness, or she could take the hand of this creature who claimed to see value in her curse. Her fingers reached out, trembling slightly until they found his hand, cold as death, solid as stone. Teach me, she whispered. Morveth's fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. Then dance with death, Iskra Vale. Let's see if you can keep up. The journey to Morveth's fortress happened in a blur of sensations Iskra couldn't quite piece together. One moment his cold hand gripped hers. The next she felt herself lifted as though she weighed nothing at all. And then the world became wind and speed, and the terrifying certainty that her feet were no longer touching ground. When solid stone finally met her boots again, everything had changed. The air itself felt different here, thicker, older, pressing against her skin like water. Iskra's breath echoed strangely, bouncing off surfaces that seemed impossibly far away, and yet close enough to touch. She stood perfectly still, head tilted, trying to map this new world through sound alone. Welcome, Morveth said beside her, his voice now layered with reverberations that suggested vast space, to the obsidian keep. The smell hit her next, iron, sharp and metallic, underneath with something sweeter, almost cloying. Roses, she realized, but not the wild ones that grew near Thornhaven. These were cultivated, deliberate, their perfume so heavy it made her light-headed. And beneath both scents, something else, old stone and older blood, the smell of a place where death had become architecture. Terror crawled up Iskra's spine with ice-cold fingers. She forced herself to breathe steadily, to keep her chin level, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Whatever this place was, showing fear would mark her as prey. The village had taught her that much. The entrance hall is 70 paces long, Morveth said, and she heard him move, his footsteps creating a rhythm against stone. 30 paces wide. The ceiling arches 40 feet above your head. There are columns every 10 paces on either side. Black marble, cold to the touch. He was mapping it for her. The realization made something tight in her chest, loosened slightly. Footsteps approached from multiple directions. Light, purposeful, inhumanly synchronized. Servants, Iskra thought, though their movements were too perfect, too coordinated. She heard fabric rustling, felt the displacement of air as bodies moved around her in what might have been a circle. "She is under my protection," Morveth's voice cut through the silence with knife-edge precision. "You will treat her with the same caution you would treat a venomous snake. Beautiful, dangerous, and not to be underestimated. She cannot see you, but she will hear every whisper, sense every intention. Deceive her, and you deceive me." A collective intake of breath, sharp and startled. Iskra realized with shock that he was afraid of her, or rather, he was making them afraid, making her dangerous by decree. "My lord," a woman's voice, silk over steel, came from Iskra's left. "Shall we prepare chambers for your guest?" "Prepare the east tower," Morveth commanded. "The rooms with the wind chimes." "Wind chimes, my lord?" "So she can hear the space around her, so she knows which direction the windows face." His hand touched Iskra's elbow gently, guiding her forward. "She navigates by sound, Morel. Give her sound to navigate with." Iskra took her first step into the echoing hall, and the fortress whispered all its secrets to her listening ears. The summons came 3 days after Iskra's arrival. A servant, one whose heartbeat was too slow to be human, informed her that King Morveth requested her presence in the throne hall for the evening assembly. The way the servant said requested made it clear there was no choice in the matter. Iskra had spent those 3 days learning the East Tower, counting steps, memorizing the placement of furniture through touch, and the way sound bounced differently off wood versus stone. She'd begun to feel almost secure in that small domain. Now, Morveth was throwing her to the wolves. The throne hall was massive. She knew this the moment she crossed the threshold. The echo of her footsteps took nearly 2 full seconds to return. The air smelled of expensive perfumes layered over that ever-present iron tang, and beneath it all, the predatory musk of too many apex creatures confined in one space. They were utterly silent. Iskra had grown up in a village where silence meant disapproval, meant people turning their backs. But this silence was different. It was the silence of hunters, watching prey, deciding whether to strike or toy with their food first. The king's newest curiosity. A woman's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberately loud, meant to intimidate. "I expected something more impressive. She looks half dead already." "Lady Vesper." Morveth's voice came from the far end of the hall, amused. "How observant." Laughter rippled through the assembly, cold and sharp. Iskra's fingers tightened on the folds of the dress the servants had given her. Fine fabric she couldn't see, couldn't appreciate, couldn't use to armor herself against their judgment. "Tell me, little peasant," Lady Vesper circled her now. Iskra could track her movement by sound and scent. "Can you even comprehend where you are, or do you stumble through our halls as blindly as you stumbled through your pathetic mortal life?" Iskra opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment her foot caught on something. Fabric, deliberately placed in her path. She felt herself falling, her hands reaching out instinctively for purchase that wasn't there. She hit the marble floor hard, the impact jarring through her bones, and the sound of it echoed through the chamber like a death knell. The laughter was immediate and vicious. Broken, she heard someone whisper. Useless, came another voice. The words her village had used, now spoken in cultured tones by creatures who'd probably never known hunger or rejection. Somehow, that made it worse. Iskra waited for Morveth's hand, for him to help her up the way he'd wrapped her in his cloak that first night. Instead, his voice came from across the hall, unchanged. Get up, Iskra. Not a suggestion, a command. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. Her palms stung where they'd scraped against stone. Every instinct screamed at her to curl up, to make herself small, to accept that the village had been right. She was broken. She was worthless. She didn't belong here or anywhere. But Morveth hadn't moved, hadn't come to her rescue, because he was making her rescue herself. Iskra pressed her palms flat against the cold marble, feeling the echo of footsteps, the placement of bodies around her. She stood slowly, deliberately, brushing the dust from her dress with as much dignity as she could summon. Her chin lifted, her sightless eyes staring straight ahead at nothing and everything. Again, she said quietly, her voice steady. I'll do it again, until I learn where you place your traps, Lady Vesper. How many times can you afford to waste before I stop falling? Morveth came to her chambers at midnight, when the rest of the court had retired to whatever dark corners they inhabited during the dead hours. Iskra heard his approach long before he knocked, those measured footsteps, that particular weight and rhythm that belonged to him alone. Come, was all he said. She followed him through corridors she'd never navigated before, her hand trailing along the wall, counting doorways, mapping the route in case she needed to find her way back, alone. They descended stairs that spiraled down and down, until the air grew colder and the echoes changed quality entirely. Where are we? Iskra asked. The grand ballroom. His voice expanded into the darkness. Empty now. I've dismissed the servants, locked the doors. There's no one here but us. The space felt enormous. Iskra stood at what she assumed was the entrance, her breathing shallow, trying to comprehend the dimensions through sound alone. The ceiling had to be impossibly high. Her exhale barely returned to her at all. You navigate by listening, Morveth said, and she heard him move deeper into the room. The court watches with their eyes and misses everything that matters. You hear what they cannot. But you're still thinking like a blind girl trying to survive. I need you to think like a predator, learning to hunt. I don't understand. Then listen. His footsteps began to move, not randomly, but with deliberate rhythm. Step, step, pause, step, step, pause, creating a pattern she could follow, a heartbeat in the darkness. The ballroom is 100 paces square. Follow my steps, match my rhythm. Don't think, just move. Iskra hesitated, terror knotting in her stomach. The memory of falling in the throne hall was still fresh, still burning. Iskra. His voice came from 20 paces away now, still moving. Trust what you hear. She took a step forward, then another. His footfalls created a path through the darkness, and she followed it, her own feet finding the rhythm he'd established. Step, step, pause. Her body began to understand what her mind was still questioning. Good. Morveth's voice was closer now, though she hadn't heard him change direction. Now, I'm going to move faster. Keep up. The rhythm accelerated. Iskra's pulse quickened with it, but her feet obeyed the pattern, following the sound of him through space. She could feel the air changing as she moved, could sense the vastness of the room around her, could hear how her own footsteps echoed differently when she approached walls versus when she stood in open space. You're counting steps, Morveth observed, and suddenly he was directly in front of her, close enough that she felt his unnatural cold. Stop counting. Just feel. His hands caught hers, cold fingers wrapping around her wrists. Iskra's breath stopped. "This is a waltz," he said quietly. "In my court, power is displayed through dance. The nobles use it to show dominance, to form alliances, to declare war without ever drawing a blade. If you're going to survive here, you need to learn their language." "I can't." "You can." His grip tightened slightly. "You've been dancing since the moment I found you in the snow. You just didn't know it had a name." He began to move, pulling her with him, and Iskra stumbled at first, her feet tangling with his. But Morveth didn't stop, didn't slow down. He kept the rhythm constant, his movements precise, and gradually her body began to understand. 3 beats. Step, step, step. Turn. His cold hands guided her, but it was the sound of their footsteps together that truly taught her. The way they created harmony when she moved correctly, dissonance when she didn't. Iskra knew something was wrong. The moment she entered her chambers, the air moved differently, flowing in patterns that contradicted the map she'd built over weeks of careful exploration. The wind chimes Morveth had installed sang in slightly altered tones, their music distorted by obstacles that shouldn't exist. Someone had rearranged her room. She stood perfectly still in the doorway, listening. The heavy armchair that belonged beneath the eastern window now sat 3 paces to the left. She could hear the way sound, deadened against its bulk, in the wrong location. The side table had been moved closer to her bed, positioned precisely where her morning path would take her, and the standing mirror, which should have been flush against the far wall, now angled outward into the room at knee height. A trap, designed to look like carelessness, like servants who'd moved things while cleaning. But Iskra had been very clear with the staff. Nothing in her chambers was ever to be relocated without her explicit permission. Morveth had made that a royal decree, which meant someone had countermanded the king's orders. "You can come out, Lady Vesper," Iskra said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I can hear you breathing in the corner. Your heart beats slower than a mortal's, but it still makes sound." A pause, then silk rustling as the vampiress stepped from the shadows near the wardrobe. "I'm impressed. Most wouldn't have noticed. Most can see." Iskra moved carefully into the room, her fingers trailing along the wall, mapping the new positions of furniture through echolocation. "They'd have walked straight into your little obstacles, fallen, maybe cracked their skull on that conveniently placed mirror. An accident, of course. The poor blind girl who couldn't navigate her own chambers. You think very highly of yourself for a peasant." "I think accurately." Iskra stopped walking, her sightless eyes fixed on exactly where Vesper stood. "You moved the armchair 7 paces from its original position. The side table is now 42 inches from my bedpost instead of 60. The mirror is angled at 15 degrees, positioned to catch anyone walking from the door to the washroom." She tilted her head. "You spent considerable time arranging this. At least an hour, I'd estimate, based on how thoroughly you've disrupted the air currents. That's dedication." Vesper's heartbeat quickened, just slightly, but Iskra heard it. Fear, beginning to bloom. "What I don't understand," Iskra continued, her voice soft and cold, "is why you'd waste so much effort on something that could never work. Did you really think I navigate by memory alone? That I stumble through darkness counting steps like a child's game?" She moved forward now, her steps confident, weaving between the displaced furniture with perfect precision. Vesper retreated instinctively, her back hitting the wall. "I hear everything, Lady Vesper. The cadence of footsteps tells me intention. The rhythm of breath reveals emotion. The quality of silence speaks louder than words." Iskra stopped just within arm's reach, close enough that her breath would ghost across the vampire's face. I heard you bribing the servants 2 weeks ago. I heard you plotting with Lord Cairn in the Eastern Gallery. I heard you telling your handmaiden that you'd find a way to remove the blind beggar from court. You're lying. Am I? Iskra smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. 3 nights ago, you met with someone in the rose garden at midnight. You discussed poison, wolfsbane mixed with iron shavings, administered slowly enough to look like wasting sickness. You argued about dosage. Your companion thought you were being too ambitious. You disagreed. The vampire's breath stopped entirely. Here's what terrifies you, Vesper, Iskra whispered. I don't need eyes to see your secrets. And in the darkness where you've lived for centuries, thinking yourselves the ultimate predators, I am the only thing that hunts better than you do. She turned and walked to her bed, navigating the chaos perfectly. Then began methodically returning each piece of furniture to its proper place through sound and touch alone. Behind her, Lady Vesper fled without another word, her footsteps frantic and graceless. The messenger arrived during breakfast, his voice echoing through the private dining hall where Iskra had been learning to navigate formal table settings by the ring of crystal against silver. She heard Morveth's sharp intake of breath, the rustle of parchment being unrolled, and then silence that stretched too long. What is it? She asked, setting down her fork with careful precision. The annual blood tax delegation, Morveth said, his tone carefully neutral. They arrive in 3 days. From where? The pause before he answered told her everything. The northern provinces, including a village called Thornhaven. The fork clattered from Iskra's nerveless fingers, striking the plate with a sound like a bell tolling. Her village, the elders who'd dragged her into the woods, the people who'd called her cursed, broken, worthless. They were coming here. Iskra, no. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble. Her carefully constructed mental map dissolved into chaos. Suddenly, she was back in the snow, hearing Elder Matthias's voice declaring her a burden the village could no longer afford, feeling hands shoving her forward into the darkness, the certainty that she would die alone and unmourned. I can't. Her breath came too fast, shallow and panicked. They can't see me here. They'll think I'm a prisoner, or a slave, or what? Morveth's voice cut through her spiral. Or they'll realize they discarded something precious. I'm not precious. The words came out raw, stripped of the confidence she'd been building. I'm the girl they threw away because I couldn't contribute, because feeding me meant some child might go hungry. They weren't wrong, Morveth. I was useless there. Footsteps approached. She felt his cold presence directly before her, close enough to touch. Sit down, he commanded. Iskra's legs obeyed. Before her mind could protest, she sank back into the chair, her hands trembling in her lap. Listen to me very carefully, Morveth said, and his voice carried the weight of 11 centuries. In 3 days, those villagers will walk into my throne room. They will bow and scrape and offer their tribute of gold and grain and whatever other pittance they think will spare them my displeasure. They will be terrified, as they should be. His hand caught her chin, lifting it firmly. And you will be standing beside my throne, dressed in silks, worth more than their entire harvest. You will wear the authority I've given you. You will hold your head high and let them see exactly what they lost when they abandoned you in my woods. I can't. You can. His grip tightened slightly. You've bested Lady Vesper, the most cunning predator in my court. You've learned to dance in darkness better than nobles who've had centuries to practice. You've turned your blindness into a weapon that makes vampires fear you. He paused. You are no longer the girl they threw away, Iskra. You are the woman I chose, and you will show them the difference. Tears burned behind her sightless eyes. What if I freeze? What if I revert to that scared peasant girl the moment I hear their voices? Then I will remind you who you've become. Morveth released her chin, but didn't step away. 3 days, Iskra. We have 3 days to ensure that when those villagers see you, they understand exactly what kind of monster they created when they left you to die. His words settled over her like armor. What do I need to do? Dance, Morveth said simply. Dance like the queen you are. The handmaidens came at dawn, their footsteps synchronized in a way that still unnerved Iskra. She'd learned their names over the past weeks, Morel, Seraphine, and Dove, though she suspected those weren't the names they'd been born with, back when they'd still been human. The dress has arrived from the seamstress, Morel announced, and Iskra heard the whisper of fabric being laid across her bed. My lady, it's breathtaking. Describe it, Iskra said, though part of her didn't want to know, didn't want to build an image in her mind that might be wrong, might be wishful thinking. Crimson silk, Seraphine began, her voice carrying the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. The color of fresh blood, my lady. It catches the light, like liquid rubies. The bodice is fitted with black lace overlay, and the skirt, it flows like water, with layers upon layers that will move when you dance. The train is 12 feet long, Dove added softly, embroidered with silver thread, in patterns of thorns and roses. It will trail behind you like a river of fire. Iskra reached out, her fingers finding the fabric. It was heavier than anything she'd ever touched. The weight of it substantial, real. This wasn't the threadbare peasant dress she'd worn in the woods, or even the fine court gowns she'd been given since arriving. This was armor, disguised as beauty. Help me into it, she said. They dressed her with careful hands, lacing the bodice tight enough that she had to concentrate on breathing, arranging the skirts so they fell in perfect cascades. When they finished, Iskra stood straighter. The dress demanded it, the architecture of boning and silk refusing to allow slouching or uncertainty. You look like a queen, Morel whispered, like something from the old stories before the kingdoms fell. Footsteps in the corridor. Morveth's distinctive rhythm, though slower than usual, almost hesitant. He entered without knocking, as was his habit, and the handmaidens immediately retreated to the corners of the room. Iskra heard him stop, heard his breath catch in a way she'd never noticed before. Turn, he said quietly. She obeyed, rotating slowly, letting him see what she couldn't. The silence stretched between them, heavy with something she couldn't quite name. I have something for you, Morveth finally said. She heard a small box open, the soft click of a clasp. A necklace. His cold fingers brushed her throat as he fastened it, and Iskra heard soft chiming, bells, tiny and delicate, interspersed along a chain. For me to navigate? She asked, confused. No. His hands rested briefly on her shoulders. For them to hear you coming. Every queen needs a herald, Iskra. In courts like mine, power announces itself. When you move through these halls, when you enter the throne room tomorrow night, they will hear you before they see you. They will know you're coming, and they will have time to fear. He stepped back, and she heard the smile in his voice. The bells aren't for the blind girl who needs help finding her way. They're for the queen who wants everyone to know she's arrived. Iskra's fingers rose to touch the necklace, feeling the delicate bells shift and sing with the movement. And tomorrow night, when the village elders see me, tomorrow night, Morveth said, they will finally understand what they threw away. And you will dance, Iskra Vale, you will dance, and they will watch, and they will know exactly what kind of queen you've become. The midwinter blood ball began with silence. Iskra stood beside Morveth's throne, her crimson dress pooling around her feet like spilled wine, the bells at her throat chiming softly with each breath. The grand ballroom had filled over the past hour with courtiers and delegates, their whispered conversations creating a tapestry of sound she'd learned to read like others read text. Then the herald's voice rang out. The tribute delegation from Thornhaven village. Iskra's heart stopped. She heard them shuffle in. 6 people, their footsteps uncertain, on the polished marble, so different from the confident glide of vampires. She knew those gaits. Elder Matthias, his left foot dragging slightly from an old injury. Elder Piotr, who walked with a cane that tapped too loudly. And others, villagers, who'd watched her exile without protest. Approach, Morveth commanded from his throne, his voice echoing through the vast space. They shuffled forward, and Iskra heard the moment they saw her. The sharp intake of breath, the stumble in Matthias's step, a whispered "Gods above." Is that Iskra? Piotr's voice cracked with disbelief. Iskra Vale. She said nothing. The bells at her throat chimed as she turned her head toward them, her sightless eyes fixed on where they stood. What have you done to her? Matthias demanded, though his voice shook. That's the blind girl the girl from our village. Is she your prisoner? Morveth laughed, low and dangerous. Prisoner? How interesting. Tell me, mortal, do prisoners wear gowns worth more than your village's annual harvest? Do they stand at a king's right hand? He rose from his throne with predatory grace. Or perhaps you're simply unable to recognize worth when it's standing before you. You've had that problem before, haven't you? The accusation landed like a physical blow. The waltz of silences, Morveth announced to the assembled court, in honor of our guests from Thornhaven, who are about to learn what they discarded in the snow. The musicians raised their instruments. Iskra's pulse hammered against her ribs, but she felt Morveth's cold hand extend toward her, felt the familiar rhythm of his presence. Show them, he whispered for her ears alone. Show them what you've become. The music began. Sharp, staccato notes that escalated rapidly into a tempo that would challenge even vampires with their supernatural speed. Iskra took Morveth's hand and stepped into the dance. The first movements were traditional, the patterns she'd learned in the empty ballroom during midnight lessons. But then, the tempo shifted, accelerating to something inhuman, and Iskra felt herself move faster than she'd ever moved before. Morveth's guidance became less about leading and more about matching her, following the rhythm she was beginning to set. She heard the ballroom through the dance, the echo of their footsteps mapping the space, the displacement of air as they spun and turned, the collective gasps of the watching court. Every sound became part of the music, every movement perfectly timed to the cascading notes of violin and harpsichord. And then she felt it, the moment when Morveth's hand loosened, when he let her lead. Iskra stepped forward into a pattern she'd never been taught, but somehow knew, a variation that should have been impossible for someone who couldn't see. She turned, her crimson skirts flying, and Morveth followed, his ancient reflexes barely keeping pace with the blind girl who now commanded the floor. She was dancing faster than light could travel, moving through space with absolute certainty, while the sighted courtiers watched in stunned silence. The music reached its crescendo, notes falling like rain, and Iskra executed a final spin that brought her back into Morveth's arms with perfect, breathtaking precision. The music ended. The ballroom erupted in applause that sounded like thunder. Iskra stood in the center of the ballroom, her chest rising and falling with exertion, the bells at her throat singing with each breath. The applause faded slowly, reluctantly, until silence reclaimed the space. Through it all, she heard the ragged breathing of the Thornhaven delegation, heard their terror as clearly as if they'd spoken it aloud. Iskra, Elder Matthias's voice cracked. We didn't know. We couldn't have known you were capable. She turned toward them, her milky eyes fixed precisely on where they stood. Valuable, worth keeping alive. Her voice carried through the ballroom with crystalline clarity. Tell me, Elder, what exactly didn't you know? The sound of knees hitting marble. They were kneeling, she realized. These men and women who dragged her into the woods and left her to die were prostrating themselves before her. We thought we were being merciful, Piotr whispered. The famine. We had to make choices. You couldn't work the fields, couldn't contribute. So, you threw away something you didn't understand. Iskra took a step forward, her crimson skirts whispering against the floor. You looked at me with your perfect eyes and saw only what I couldn't do. You never once asked what I could. Please, Matthias begged. We were wrong. We see that now. If you'd just... What do you see? Iskra's voice cut through his pleading like a blade. Now, standing in this ballroom, watching me dance with a king, do you see me, or do you see your mistake? Silence. The kind of silence that confesses everything. I navigated your village for 20 years, Iskra continued, her voice steady and cold. I knew when the baker burned bread by the smell carried on the wind. I knew when storms were coming by the change in air pressure. I knew when people lied because their heartbeat betrayed them. She tilted her head. But you never asked what I heard, what I felt, what I knew. You only saw the eyes that didn't work and decided that made me worthless. She felt Morveth's presence behind her, silent support, letting her claim this moment. You're right about one thing, Iskra said quietly. You didn't know. You didn't know that the girl you discarded would become someone who commands the darkness better than you command the light. You didn't know that your burden would become a queen. She paused, letting the weight of it settle. But ignorance is not innocence, Elder Matthias. You chose not to see. That's not the same as being blind. What would you have us do? Piotr whispered. Iskra smiled, and it was not kind. You saw a burden. He saw a queen. She gestured toward Morveth without looking. Leave my woods. Return to your village. And when your children ask about the blind girl you exiled, tell them the truth, that you were the ones who couldn't see. She turned her back on them, the ultimate dismissal, and heard their scrambling retreat. The sound of their terrified footsteps faded into the distance, followed by the heavy doors closing behind them. Morveth's hand found hers, cold fingers intertwining with her warm ones. Your Majesty, he said softly, and she heard the approval in his voice, the pride. Iskra squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of her crimson dress, the chiming of her bells, the power thrumming through the ballroom like a heartbeat. She had danced in the snow to stay alive. Now she danced as a queen. Take me home, she whispered. Morveth's laugh was low and warm. You're already there. And for the first time since the village had cast her out, Iskra Vale knew it was true.